we've been obsessing about this for a long time. You, me, many people. But it seems like at the moment we're sort of past the range where post-election chaos is probably going to come into play, right? If Biden wins by 10 points, we're probably not worried about a lot of the bad stuff that we've been worrying about. Is that right?
I think some of the nightmare scenarios become less probable at that point.
Yeah.
If the polls hold up, the election isn't close enough that a single state could tip the election, for instance, and the signal to Republican elites that they should move away from Trump becomes stronger. So some of those kinds of scenarios go off the table. There's other kinds of bad post-election scenarios that we might worry about, though, like violence, like the president, maybe if he not refusing to concede, at least not acknowledging the legitimacy of his defeat. And those, I think, are still a concern, even if Biden's lead holds up.
Why would it be a concern if he refuses to acknowledge the legitimacy of his defeat? If he loses by 10 points, if Biden has 350, 400 electoral votes? In that circumstance, aren't most Republicans just going to usher him off the stage and then it'll just be ineffectual ranting?
It's a good question. You may be more optimistic than I am. And we tend to have this bipartisan affirmation of the transfer of power and the legitimacy of the new administration. Even in more partisan times in the past, that has often happened. If we're denied that, one can imagine less confidence in the electoral system, less belief in the legitimacy of the president than we might otherwise have had. And that's a particular concern because we've already seen campaigns of illegitimacy against a number of recent presidents right from the beginnings of their administration, whether it was saying that Barack Obama was a legitimate president because he supposedly wasn't born in this country, or Bill Clinton was a legitimate president because he failed to win 50% of the vote. Right. And of course, George W. Bush took office under disputed circumstances after Florida, right? So we have a kind of discourse of legitimacy that often comes up. In this case, though, we might see a defeated president poison the well for their successor in a way we haven't seen before. And that does worry me, even in what would be a kind of modern blowout scenario.
And if we don't have a blowout, if, say, the polls tighten by a few points or the polls are off in Biden's favor in a few points, and so we go from Biden winning the national vote by 10 to Biden winning the national vote by, say, 4 points, if you have, 3 points from poll error and 3 points of movement, then you could be in the range where you're really disputing the election. So let's start off with the median scenario in that happens. So suppose Biden is winning the national vote by 3 to 4 points. What do you think that looks like in the days or weeks after the election?
Well, so at that point, it's possible, although not necessarily likely, that we may be waiting on a longer process of counting mail ballots if it comes down to a state where we expect that mail ballot count to take longer. So imagine that the race comes down to Pennsylvania, and because of that movement you've described, right? 3 points of movement in the polls, 3 points of polling error, that now the pivotal state in the Electoral College is now within range of being disputed. There's a vote counting process going on, and potential shenanigans are starting to happen, trying to get ballots thrown out, people exploring scenarios like disputed slates of electors, other kinds of outcomes that essentially take the process from strictly being about vote counting to a kind of political power play. And one thing this process has taught me is how few guardrails there are at that point. Mm-hmm. The system depends on people within it following norms, and we've seen that's not a very effective constraint on politics in the Trump administration.
So one thing I hear from a lot of my friends when they think about post-election scenarios, and the really scary ones, is not just that kind of dispute, but something involving a lot of violence. Because you have seen armed groups on the very far right that are very loyal to Donald Trump. But can you explain how, or if at all, their involvement would be pertinent? I mean, aside from the possibility of tragedy, could that actually come into play in an important way in the outcome?
I've heard two scenarios where these kinds of armed pseudo militias might affect the outcome. The first is by deterring participation in Democratic strongholds. So let's say large numbers of armed men take up residence outside polling stations all over Philadelphia.
Right.
And word gets around on social media, people feel uncomfortable going to vote there. It drives Democratic numbers down. Trump narrowly wins the state. That turns out to be the pivotal state.
Yeah.
There's no evidence of this, but given other things we've seen in recent years, there's at least reason for concern. I think because our system is so decentralized and there's so many polling places, the likelihood of doing that at a scale that would move numbers at the statewide level, that seems beyond the level of coordination that these kinds of militias could achieve. I think I'd be more worried about the Brooks Brothers riot on steroids version of this, where large numbers of armed people show up during the count, or when judicial or legislative bodies are making decisions related to the electoral process, right? We've already seen armed men essentially shut down the Michigan state legislature.
Right.
And we've seen a bunch of Republican operatives shut down a vote count in Florida back in 2000, right?
Yeah.
So there's clearly the potential to interfere in these kinds of processes and to scare people. So you can imagine that kind of thing, especially imagine the frenzy that could ensue if it seems that the election is coming down to this count and people are being told 24/7 on Fox and on the internet that the election is being stolen, and it's these people who are doing it, right? How many people are going to get in their cars and drive down there? It doesn't take that many. It's important to be clear that a lot of these events are tail risks. They're not things that are likely to happen, but they're things that experts think are significant concerns and that we should take seriously. Right?
Right.
When they stop your airplane from taking off because of a maintenance issue, it's not because they think the plane is necessarily going to crash, but they think the risk is significant enough. They'd like to prevent that risk from endangering the people on the plane, right? And I think that's how we should think about a lot of these scenarios. I'm not predicting that all of them will happen. I'm saying the risk is sufficient that we need to take them seriously and think about what we can do to avert them.